Hey guys, Sam here. Welcome back to the Precision Rifle Load Development Series. This is going to be part 3, and in this episode we're going to talk about picking a powder to use as well as a primer, and also how to come up with our starting charge. Now before we get started in that, I need to back up a couple of steps and go over some things that I didn't cover in the first 2 episodes. Okay, one of the first things I should have brought up when I started this load development series is the importance of keeping good notes. Now I keep notes on everything that I develop loads for and everything that I shoot. I have a barrel log that I'll start keeping track of how many rounds go down this tube. I keep notes on all the different component lots. I just jot down the lot number. I keep notes on my seating depths, my powder charges, my neck tension, size bushing I use in the bushing dies, whether I annealed the brass or not, how did it feel when I was seating them, what kind of group size did I get out of a particular load, how much, what was the velocity, what was the ES. Those are all the things I write in my notebook, and it doesn't really matter what I do. You can do what I do, but just come up with something for yourself that makes it, number one, safe, and number two, gives you a foundation to replicate loads that work later on down the road. So not only with this rifle is that going to pay dividends for me, but also in the next rifle that I build in 260. Not only that, but to give you a good example, some of the stuff I'm starting with here is simply because I've already used it in several other 260s. So, I kept notes on those other rifles and it's paying dividends now. But anyway, keep notes. Okay, let's back it up a couple of steps and talk about bullets again. As soon as I released that video, I started getting questions in about modified cases and do I really need the custom one turned on the lathe and all that stuff. And another question that I got was, am I going to consider a magazine length restrictions when I build this rifle? Well, yes, I have to run a magazine in this rifle because it's a PRS competition rifle. The most common one is the AI mag. This is just a 10-round AI mag. I've been using them for years. I like them. Mine are unmodified. They work just fine. So, long story short, several years ago, I ordered up a reamer from JGS. I sent them a dummy round, was just a piece of Lapua 260 brass with a 140 grain Berger hybrid seated at magazine length. And I told them I want this dimension plus 10 thousandths of jump to the lance, and that's what they cut the reamer at. Well, at the time, we didn't have 130 grain bullets, competitive bullets for 260s or any 6.5s. So at the time, the 140 grain hybrid was the longest bullet on the market as far as nose length. So I figured if I can jump the 140 grain hybrid 10 thousandths, then it'll give me plenty of room with all the other 140 grain bullets. Well, fast forward to 2017 and 18, and all of a sudden we have some really good 130 grain bullets either already on the market or coming into play. So what I'm running into is, well, yes, I have a ton of room in my magazine now for just about any bullet, well, anything the 140 grain hybrid and shorter in nose length to actually get to the lands. The downside to that is I have a lot of case capacity I'm giving up, and I'm also in danger of running out of a neck grip on the bullet. In other words, I'm in danger of running out of bearing surface on the bullet as it goes into the neck. But right now everything's peachy. I've already kind of tested that with the 130s, and I don't have a problem. But long story short, this rifle is designed, the chamber is designed to be used with a magazine like this. If you have any more questions about that, I have a bullet seating depth video I did last year that goes into depth talking about magazine length restrictions versus cartridge-based ogive dimensions. The rifle I use in that video is a Savage. It has a nice long magazine capacity as well as a detachable magazine and a chamber that's cut to suit that. So anyway, that's the deal on my seating depth on this one. The other question had to do with modified cases, and can I use a regular case or do I have to do the custom case? You can use whatever you want and they will both work. The only thing I will tell you is that once you start with one or the other, keep using that throughout the life of the gun because it's a relative number that you're going to be using to check throat wear and adjust seating depth later on down the road. So what I would do is I would use the same case that you started with, and I would also use the same exact bullet that you started with and keep them in a bag. I keep all mine in these little Ziploc bags and mark what the gun's for. in an ideal world, if I wanted to be perfectly accurate with everything, as I go through this entire project, I would take a piece of this Lapua brass that I'm starting with, and I would expand the neck out so a bullet would slide in and out of it easily. I'd drill and tap it, and I would use this new piece, that's a modified case, to take my initial measurement and base my seating depth for the first 300 pieces of brass that I need to fire on that measurement. And at the end of that, I would take a fired piece of brass, I would modify the case, bump the shoulder back 2/1000ths, and I would take another throat measurement, and I would go through the whole seating depth process again. Now, if you want to do that, you can. I'm not going to. What I did was I took a fired case because I know 300 rounds from now, that's what I'm going to be using. So at 300 rounds from now, I'm going to take a throat measurement just to see if I have any burn or anything like that. And all of my future seating depth measurements will be based on that throat measurement when I'm done firing this new brass. Until I get to that point, I'm going to add 5 to 10 thousandths of my seating depth onto the new brass, because you're going to get a little bit shorter measurement from your new brass than you will with the new brass. In other words, you're going to be jumping further with this fired piece of brass than you will with this new piece of brass. And the reason for that is that you have a lot of stretch induced into that case when you fire it. So a brand new piece of brass is pretty loose. It depends on how your chamber's cut, obviously, but you're going to get 5 to 10 thousandths probably a stretch in your headspace dimension from a new piece of brass to a fired piece of brass. We're only going to be pushing back 2/1000ths of that, so the length difference has to be made up somewhere. So typically what happens is, the only time you're going to be unsafe with this is if you take your fired modified case with this dimension for your cartridge-based ogive length and you decide, I'm going to take a new piece of brass and I'm going to seat it right on the lands. You're not really going to be on the lands, you're going to be into the lands. And for most cases that won't be a big deal, but if you're playing with high pressure, especially with loads that you're not familiar with and powder you're not familiar with, you could have problems if you don't recognize the pressure signs. So to be safe, I would recommend, if you're using a fired modified case, start at least 5 thousandths longer, in other words further away from the lands with your new brass than you would with your fired brass. Okay, I'll be running H4350 in this project. I think H4350 is hands down the best powder on the planet for 260 Remington. It has a really good blend of speed, accuracy, and consistency. Having said that, it's not the only powder you can use, but it's the one that I like the most. So I have 2 8-pounders set aside for this project. There's 7,000 grains in a pound, so that gets me a little over 2,500 shots from the same lot. I don't have to worry about anything. So anyway, let's talk about how to come up with a starting point for a charge weight. Okay, there are a few different ways to come up with a starting charge weight. The best way is to come up with a charge weight that you have experience with. So I'm going to start with data that I have collected over several different 260s over the years using H4350, and that's going to be my starting point. The next best thing would be to talk to your gunsmith or talk to a buddy that has a lot of experience with that cartridge. They're bound to have good information for you to use to start with. The next best one is the internet. There's a lot of garbage out there for sure, but there's also a lot of good information that comes from people who are willing to share it. Now, it's your responsibility to learn how to recognize pressure signs and to be safe with the information that everybody's giving you. Some of those things you have to consider when you're coming up with a charge weight and you're using somebody else's information is what components did they use, what was their maximum cartridge overall length, how far off the lands were they, and things like that. You have to consider all of that. Case capacity will differ from brand to brand in brass depending on how thick it is. That will affect pressure. Primers can affect pressure. Seating into the lands versus seating off of the lands has a big effect on pressure. So if you're copying somebody else's load, be sure that you are looking at the entire load recipe and the whole package. And if you don't have that, proceed with extreme caution. Having said all of that, it's not as bad as it sounds. If you are staying within the lines of common loads for all of these cartridges, you shouldn't have any problems. I will tell you to work slowly and find a middle of the road load and work out from there or work down from there, however which way you want to go. I think if you don't have any experience at all with reloading, like none, I think it's best that you pick up a commercial load book, especially if you can find one from the bullet manufacturer that you plan on using, and start with that. There's a lot of good information in these books, not just about load recipes, but about reloading in general, ballistics, and how all of it fits together. So it's a good investment if you haven't ever reloaded before. If you have reloaded and have a bunch of experience under your belt, I would say the best place to go, barring personal experience, would be somewhere on the internet, find a load, and back off just a little bit and work up to pressure on that load. Now every barrel is going to react a little bit differently to any given load. It has to do with the inner bore dimensions of the barrel, as well as what kind of rifling it has in it, and also how the chamber's cut, what kind of reamer was used. So if you go get that information dug up on the internet or from your buddy or even in a load book, just be prepared for the velocity not to match when you get done working up that load to exactly the same recipe. No big deal. It's completely normal. It happens across the board. You might get a faster load or you might get a slower load. Don't worry about it. The biggest thing is you're trying to build data and consistency and accuracy into your barrel with a load. So let me expand a little bit on that internet sourcing for your charge weight starting point. One of the things that I didn't think of to mention is that just about every powder manufacturer, bullet manufacturer out there also has some kind of page built into their website where they'll give you a safe starting point for a charge. And it's going to be very similar to what you get in one of those books. So don't forget about that when you start looking for a place to start. Let's talk a little bit about primers. These are the spark plugs of the whole operation. These light up the powder for us. For this project, I'm going to be running CCI 250s. They are the large rifle magnum primers that CCI produces. Several years ago, I started trying them in 260 and 243, and they work like a champ. So right now what I have is a situation where just about everything I'm shooting, with the exception of one, which is my 7WSM, likes these magnum primers. So it's really cool for me because I can run everything from my 260 all the way up to my 338 Edge plus P with exactly the same primer. So I can buy these locally, and going by my same thing that I said when I started talking about picking components, pick the stuff that's available that you can buy easily. CCI 250s are real easy to buy around here locally, so I don't have to have them shipped in and pay hazmat. I have just about every primer sitting in my vault room where all my powder stuff is, so I can try it all, but I just keep coming back to that CCI 250. It just works really well. The primer, I think, is one of the very last things I change, and I only do it to diagnose something. In other words, boy, I just can't get my ES down no matter what I've tried. Maybe I should try a different primer, that sort of thing. So for now, we're going to be running CCI 250 Magnum primers in the 260. Alright, well, I already have a video on my YouTube channel that shows how I prime, deprime, and general case prep. If you're interested in going and watching that, do a little recap on that. This is the RCBS automatic primer. It's a pretty cool little system. This tube holds your primers, and then to put a primer in the little cup here, just pull, and it's got a gate right there, and when you release it, there's the primer. So you just put the case in, prime it. This has really good feel, and it's nice and firm, so you make sure that you get your same seat depth every time. Then of course these load blocks are the ones from Sinclair. One of the things I like to do is rub my finger over the end of the case when I'm done to make sure that that primer is seated to its maximum depth. Just like when you're doing powder too, when we move over to the other bench, I like to keep the primers that I'm using right now in the tube, that are loaded in this tube, keep them out close to the machine so that I know exactly what's in this thing. We'll go over that a little bit more when we start throwing powder as well, but I've had a lot of people ask, what about the hand primers? I use those for a lot of years. I actually prefer this machine. The hand primers, what I didn't like about them is that the way they work, you know, they cam over, at least the RCBS ones do. They cam over, they have that round camming system so that when you squeeze the handle you can't go too far. So when you get to that point, it kind of cams over, it rolls over. A lot of times on some cases, some primers, I wasn't getting a full seat with those. RCBS was really good about sending me a different push rod for them, and for the most part it fixed it, but I really prefer this little gadget. It's been a really good tool for me. Okay, I've determined what my starting charge weight is going to be according to some notes that I kept from my first 260 barrel. It was also the first barrel that I started shooting the AR hybrids in, the burger bullets, as well as the first barrel that I tried the CCI 250s to light off H4350s. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to replicate the starting load of that gun, of that load that I shot through that rifle, with the biggest difference being the amount of jump to the lands that I have in this gun versus that one. Now that one was chambered for 140 AMAXs seated long, so we were running a Wyatt's box magazine. We had a lot of room in the case. That bullet was hanging way out there. And then midstream I decided I want to put a Macmillan A3 stock on it and run detachable bottom metal so I could run an AI mag. Well, we didn't do anything with the barrel or the chambering, so what I had was about a 200 thousandths jump when loaded at mag length. Now this load here is going to be pretty close to what that one looked like. It's going to be quite a bit shorter in the case because the lands in this barrel are actually cut for the 140 hybrid. So the 130 hybrid is a lot shorter bullet. I'm going to have a ton of room in the magazine, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the starting load of that old 260 barrel, and then I'm going to run this first load 20 thousandths off the lands to help accommodate the difference between my fired modified case and a brand new case. So I've got Chargemaster warmed up and calibrated, so I'm just going to start throwing powder. When I do this, I take a post-it note and I pretty much just write out what my plan is for this load, and then if I do any kind of different charge weights, I'm going to put the charge weights in order like this, and I'm going to load the cases in order to match that piece of paper. And then when I'm done, this will go inside that ammo box there so I don't get confused. So let's get fired up. Okay, here's a safety tip for you guys that are just starting to reload. When you're doing any kind of load process like this and you're using a certain powder, it's helpful to only keep the powder you're using right there next to the machine or whatever you're using, the powder measure or Chargemaster or what have you. Don't have any other powder open or anywhere near your dispenser when you're throwing charges. And that bottle will stay right there, right next to that thing until I empty it out and put it away. So, you know, I've heard a lot of horror stories of guys accidentally putting pistol powder in their rifle cases or stuff like that. Don't be that guy. It's real easy not to do that, so just come up with a system that helps you figure out how not to do that, because that's really bad. Now, a lot of guys talk about needing real fancy scales, Sartoriuses and stuff like that, and fancy trickler systems. I've never used any of that stuff. I think, you know, if they want to use that, that's fine. But anything you've ever seen me shoot on video or in targets or groups or whatever has all been done just like this, right off of this machine, or a Chargemaster Lite, or a 10-0-10 mechanical scale. You know, try it out for yourself. If you think you need to have one of those scales, then have at her, but I've never felt the need. So my starting charge for this is going to be 42.0 grains of H4350, and I'm going to run 20 thousandths off the lands. That gives me a measurement with my comparator at the ogive at 2.050. And then what I'm going to do in this next one is I'm going to load up 3 at 42.5 grains. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get up to pressure slowly but quickly and see where it tops out. Now on that first barrel that I'm trying to replicate the load on, the ending charge for that barrel was 43.8 grains H4350. But the geometry, or the whatever you want to call it, between the bullet and the lands and the magazine was completely different in that gun. So I'm going to start at the starting point, and I'm just going to start walking it up half grain at a time until I hit pressure. Now when I hit that pressure, I'm going to back it off half a grain, and I'll start tuning it in 2/10 grain probably increments. Another safety tip, or more of a convenience tip, is move the powder funnel as soon as you're done throwing the charge in that case. Because it really sucks when you accidentally throw a double charge in one of these cases. It's messy. Now when we get into charging entire blocks of cases, when we figure out our load, what I like to do is charge the entire block and then look right down on top of it at every single one and make sure there's powder in them. Right now what I do is I keep 3 in a line in a block like this, just to keep it easier to keep track of where I'm going. So the second batch is going to be 42.5 grains. You know, I hear all kinds of horror stories about these electronic powder measures and dispensers. I've never had a lick of trouble with these. They're awesome. I started out with just the scale. I was using a Redding BR30, I believe, powder measure, and I would throw charges into that. And stick powder, obviously I had to throw them light, put them on that scale, and then just tap in. I had a 338 Win Mag case, and I would just tap in the last few kernels. But once I started using this dispenser, that's a ticket. And that does have the McDonald's straw in it to help slow down those kernels as they come to the end of the tube. And it really made a big difference on how many charges I had that were overweight. So if you haven't tried it yet and you're having trouble with it throwing too much because it clumps up at the end and then drops out too much when it's trying to trickle that last tenth, try that straw trick. It's pretty slick. Alright, so we have 3 loaded at 42 and 3 loaded at 42.5, so let's go ahead and seat some bullets. Okay, I've already decided that my seating depth is going to be 2.050, which puts me about 20 thousandths off the lands with a fired modified case. So I'm thinking that's going to come in somewhere between 10 and 15 thousandths with a new case. So I'm going to back off my seating die just a little bit. The last bullet I seated in here was the 130 ELDM. So we're going to put 130 AR hybrids in now. I'm going to start with the 42s. I think that this is one of the most important steps in the entire reloading sequence for getting good accuracy as well as low ES in your velocity spreads. So I'm going to use the same comparator I always do. I zeroed it. Alright. So I know I've got a ways to go. Alright, so this is the Redding competition seating die. It has a micrometer top on it. It's very easy to adjust. It does adjust exactly how it's marked. So if you need to go 2 thousandths, that's what you get when you move it 2 thousandths. So I'm going to go ahead and step her up a little bit. And then I'm going to slow down right at the end. Now if you're running a compressed charge, like I do in the 260 Terminator, it's helpful when you come down at that bottom on that stroke if you pause for a second, because you'll get pushback from that powder, and if you just let it settle, a lot of times it will settle down into the case. But we're not compressed with this charge, so I can probably run it up pretty quick. So I need to go 9 thousandths. So I'm going to dial in 9 thousandths. So there's 2.050, and that's exactly what I want to start with. So when I get done seating the bullet, I move the case up to the left corner of the block like that. That lets me know I have to do these two. Now I always look inside the case, make sure there's powder in there. twice. It's always a good sign when all the bullets seat exactly the same and you don't have to fiddly fart around with your mic top on your seating die. So in that other video that I have about bullet seating depth, there's a lot of information in that video as well as in the article. I'll just touch on a couple of things here, and I'll say that no matter what you read about certain bullets liking to be seated a certain distance away from the lands, don't be afraid to try other things. There are some, there's a lot of information out there that I think was written in response to people's questions, and they wanted to cover as much as possible in one article or whatever, so they came up with a fancy system and fancy names for it to pretty much fend off any further questions. I will tell you that most of these bullets that I've shot in every rifle over the last 10 years have generally done very well 10 thousandths off the lands. Sometimes I can get them a little bit better. Sometimes the ES will come down if I go further, or sometimes even closer to the lands, but 10 thousandths off the lands has been a really good place to start. And in that first 260 barrel I was telling you about, I had to jump so far with all these other bullets when I was running out of magazine that some of them were literally jumping 1/4 of an inch to the lands. And those loads still shot 1/4 minute out of that gun. So don't be afraid to jump them, and don't be afraid to seat them close to the lands. Sometimes you'll get a barrel that will shoot a particular bullet from the lands all the way out to 1/4 off. So don't be afraid to try new stuff. Alright, so I have the 6 loads. Actually, it's 2 different loads with 3 shots each of the 130 hybrids. I already loaded up some ELDMs that are to the same spec. So what we're going to do is we're going to shoot both of these, and we're going to keep really good notes and see what we end up with. Okay, I was just looking at my raw footage there, and I noticed that I forgot to mention another method for you to come up with a charge weight, and that is quick load. Quick load is software. It's a computer program that you can buy that will give you a lot of different options depending on the parameters that you enter into it. So say I have a 260 Remington. I'm going to tell it I'm loading for a 260 Remington. I have a 26-inch barrel. My twist rate is 1 and 8. What's my good load? What bullet am I going to shoot? I'll put that in there, and it'll tell me all the different powders that I can use in that case and what the expected pressure and velocity is according to the barrel length. So that is another avenue. It's a pretty expensive program. I don't own it, but my buddy Sean does, and he uses it a lot for his Wildcat development because he can go in and change things to see like how much pressure he's going to expect out of a Plus P or a Terminator and whatever cartridge he's working with. But anyway, that's another option for you. If you have a friend that has quick load, don't ignore the utility of using something like that. Okay, the next step is going to be to see what this does on one of these. So I'll probably end up loading up a couple more strings tonight. We have some pretty crappy weather right now, and it's just a swamp out there where I shoot, so I might be able to do some shooting tomorrow. But anyway, I'm going to video it all, and we're going to talk about what we see on the target and what my next step is going to be during the load development. So until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.